They claim to speak for the people, the real people. They say they fight the elite, and their appeal is growing. From Donald Trump in the United States to the rise of the National Front here in France, Nigel Farage and the UK Independence Party, Geert Wilders and the Dutch, or indeed the Austrian Freedom Parties. And it's not just confined to right-wing parties. There's also the far-left Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain. Populists are popular. So is it power to the people or a degraded form of democracy? Well, let's get those views from today's guest. Welcome Jan-Werner Müller. Mr. Müller, you are a professor of politics at Princeton University, author of several books, the most recent published almost simultaneously in French and in English, entitled What is Populism? And, well, I've given a bit of a shopping list of various parties and people that are defined as such, but for you, what exactly is populism?
So today one has the tendency to often say whoever criticizes elites must be a populist. I think that's wrong. I think in a democracy anybody can criticize elites, can have a problem with those in government, the powerful and so on. It's almost the job of democratic citizens to be critical of their elites. Populists always also do something else. They say that they and only they truly represent what they often call the real people. Now that might sound relatively harmless at first sight, but it has two important consequences. First of all, they essentially say that all the other parties, all the other political contenders are essentially illegitimate, and at the level of the citizens, at the level of, if you like, the people, they also say that whoever doesn't support us has their status as properly belonging to the people put into doubt. Let me just give you a brief example. When Nigel Farage still during the Brexit night, said this has been a victory for what he called real people, he of course also was saying that the 48% who wanted to stay in the EU somehow weren't quite real. So it's this double exclusion at the level of other political parties and at the level of people that characterizes populists.
At the same time, it does appear that populists are growing in popularity. Are they not playing into a very serious problem in our political system? The traditional parties do seem increasingly more distant from the people.
I'm a little wary of that characterization. If one says, as one often does, there's a great sort of divide between the establishment and the people, one has already made a huge concession to populists in a certain sense. Because the people themselves, they don't really speak in a certain way. We're just listening to what populist leaders are saying about them. And very often, of course, they have real issues, they have a real sense of alienation.
Austerity.
It's absolutely true, but we shouldn't take at face value the descriptions that populists offer us of their own voters. Plus, I think importantly, not everybody who's called a populist today is necessarily a populist. So as you said at the beginning, one often talks about Syriza and Podemos as left-wing populist parties. At least from my point of view, they're actually not.
For you, it's
they
more right-wing.
Criticize elites, but that's not enough. They don't say that we and only we represent the Greek or Spanish people. They don't have this anti-pluralist dimension that proper populists have. And in a sense, even though we very often also hear today about a so-called crisis of representation everywhere in Europe, I think you can read the cases of Spain and Greece exactly in the opposite way. You can say that in a certain way, the Greek party system and the Spanish party system have adapted to what undoubtedly is the major political conflict in Southern Europe today, austerity versus, for shorthand, anti-austerity. Those systems were able to reflect this conflict with new parties. Just imagine if in 2011 or 2012, people would have said, look, we no longer have any trust in the system. We're going outside the system. We're only doing politics on the street. We're doing violence. That hasn't happened. New parties have formed. They're in parliament. And in a certain way, it shows the opposite of a crisis of representation.
At the same time, what we're seeing also is a lot of centre-right parties moving more to that far right as a way of answering, if you like, this populist rise. We're seeing it here in France with Nicolas Sarkozy moving more towards the statements that we would have associated with Marine Le Pen. We saw also Viktor Orban in Hungary moving over to the Jobbik, the far-right National Party stance. Is that the only way to kind of counteract the popularity of these populists, or their very simple message?
Yes, I think it's a fateful mistake for the simple reason that if you start copying them, people are likely to say, well, look, why shouldn't I vote for the original? Plus, maybe some of these parties have told us all along that people like Marine Le Pen and Jobbik are totally unacceptable. Now it turns out you do the same thing, or as in the case of Hungary, you even collaborate with them. So, in a sense, the stigma also disappears. So I think that's the absolutely wrong way. What should one do instead? Well, there's no panacea. But I think one should definitely not exclude them from a debate completely, as sometimes people want to do. In a sense, that's a way of answering their exclusions with another exclusion, which is a contradiction in a certain way. One should talk with them, but one should not talk like them. One should not accept the way that they frame problems, because in a sense, even something like unemployment, which is an objective problem, is always couched in some language about what caused it, what to do about it, and so on. So if one goes down the road of the sort of FN-style slogan from the 80s, 1 million unemployed, 1 million immigrants, oh, what do we have to do? That's a fateful mistake. So don't copy them, but talk to them, and at the same time, sometimes, maybe less obviously, also sometimes ignore them. Because one of the, I think, fateful things that the British elite, if one can generalize like this, did, was to basically accept Nigel Farage as the central figure of British politics, who ended up defining the issues, who ended up saying that, yes, this is a fight of basically English freedom versus Brussels dictatorship, and everybody else sort of ran after that narrative in a certain way, instead of saying, yeah, okay, you have 11% maybe of the vote, that's important, we engage with that, but that's not the only issue, and we can phrase things differently, we can frame things differently.
And yet we are seeing increasingly in governments across the European Union these very nationalist and populist parties becoming part of government. We've seen it in Finland, we've seen it in Hungary. Do you think Viktor Orban, he's changed quite a lot since he was in power? How is the best way to counteract that message? At a certain point, they are needed now, and they are elected by the people, so they have a legitimate place.
They are sometimes elected, and we have to recognize that, of course, that's democracy. But what we don't have to recognize is their claim to exclusive representation, because Viktor Orban de facto doesn't really recognize anything like legitimate opposition. Or think of Kaczynski in Poland, who says that if you criticize me, you're basically a traitor to the nation, as he did. You have, treason in your genes. So that we don't have to accept. And we have to basically say, look, this has to remain a pluralist system where we have, changes in government and in power and so on. And if we see characters like Orban essentially change the entire institutional system in his own favor, then one has to speak up and say, wait a minute, yeah, we understand what you're doing, because you are basically telling us that only your party is the real representative of the people. So of course you want to be in power forever, but that is no longer democracy.
Well, let's look at the very recent example in Hungary. They held this referendum on the relocation of refugees across the EU. Only 40% of the population voted. Okay, 99% of them voted in favour of what Orban wanted was to categorically refuse Brussels dictating that the country would take in refugees. Orban now says he's going to change the constitution in order to validate this referendum. How much do you think the EU needs to react? It needs to, it's an EU member, Hungary, and so far the EU has said this is not what we agree with, but there hasn't been any consequences.
So I think what people should have said from the outside, and should say now, is not just that the so-called referendum was invalid, but that it actually was also illegal, according to Hungarian law, that this question could not have been posed as a referendum question. And people actually made this point initially, but then all the relevant institutions within Hungary, Constitutional Court, Election Commission, and so on, of course said, no, it's fine. But why did they say that? Because they're already in Orban's pocket. So that was already a sign that the whole system of checks and balances isn't really working, because he gets his way all the time. So
the EU?
That's one thing. The other thing is that, indeed, there should have been all kinds of sanctions a long time ago. The hurdles for doing that institutionally in Europe are very high. It's not easy to activate these mechanisms. But there are also other options, which I think is the fault of our political leaders, that they haven't exercised these options. In particular, Orban's party remains a member of the European People's Party, so the Christian Conservative alliance in the European Parliament, the largest alliance of parties. And I think at the very latest, when Orban started to talk in 2015 about reintroducing the death penalty, others should have said, look, this is incompatible with European Christian democracy.
So is it a weakness? Is that a sign of weakness on behalf of the European Union?
It's a sign of weakness of the European Union that we have created a situation where effectively you can be both inside and outside, because Hungary and also Poland get all the subsidies. At the same time, they don't play by the rules. So it's better than Brexit in a certain way, because you remain inside, you have all the benefits. At the same time, you can already be de facto outside in certain ways.
But that's not going to change, is it?
Hopefully it is going to change if there were more political will, and maybe if this also became more of an issue within national debates. I think if all this were happening at a time when there weren't so many other issues on politicians' plates, one could imagine a different outcome. Remember 2000 when actually it wasn't technically the European Union, it was the other member states that took sanctions against Austria. We can debate whether that was justified or not, but that was not impossible. But that was not a time when at the same moment we had the Euro crisis, we had lots of refugees coming to Europe. So people feel,
grown as well
leaders feel that, we don't have political capital right now to spare. We don't want to be seen as, not only telling member states what their national budgets have to look like, but also what their national democracies have to look like. So we're just not going to go down that road. But I think in a certain way, what is happening in Hungary and also Poland, that in a sense touches the moral foundations of the EU much more than the Euro crisis. Because one, it's important that the euro doesn't collapse, etc. But this is just ultimately a matter of economic policies. Of course, a lot of suffering has resulted from this. But you could imagine a European Union without the euro. It's not inconceivable. A European Union where we have lots of quasi-authoritarian regimes inside, it's not imaginable.
Okay, so perhaps we'll end on that positive note. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Mr. Müller. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks also, of course, to you at home for having watched. That brings us to the end of this edition of The Interview.